I have a 3-year-old dog that is just being a ding dong. She is outside and she does not want to come in, or else she whines until I open the door and then doesn't want to come in. So I'm in the living room, and when she whines again, you might be able to hear it. I'm going to get up, try to let her in, but I may just come back very exasperated. It just it's irritating. She doesn't remember that we go on walks and runs with her all the time. All she remembers is that she wants something now. Okay. Now I wanted to, before we dive into everything, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the rest of the semester is going to look like. This is the last real module that we have where you need a weekly reflection. And if you look on the reflection description for this week, it references the video reflection that I talked about last week. That everybody can do. You know, if you're missing any weekly reflections, you can go back and do it with a video reflection. I wanted to go over that and also talk about how the final is structured. So, oh, by the way, Jenny, hi. Now, I'm only requiring 14 weekly reflections, and one of the reasons is because you guys have six projects. So the last couple of weeks, we are going to be talking about stuff and referencing earlier modules and things like that. But the big thing over the next couple of weeks is I want to talk about people's projects and share what people have done with everybody, so you can see. Because I know a lot of us get busy and we'll probably want to do a couple projects over the next couple of weeks to get all those finalized or catch up on weekly reflections. So I'm going to share my screen and show you what the final module looks like. If I can figure out how to share my screen, hold on a sec. I know I've done it before. All right. So the final setup is you have your final capstone project. And then there's a discussion about it where it'll give you so that other people can see your stuff. And then there is an in-class final. Now, of course, we're online, so the in-class, calling it in-class is a little bit problematic. And don't pay attention to the due date on this. What it's actually going to be is it's going to be due on December 13th. With the in-class final, you know that you can't see it yet because it hasn't been published yet. I will publish it on the first day of finals, and it will be due by midnight on the last day of finals. The department mandate is that all of us are required to administer a final of some sort. And what this one is, you basically have 4 questions, and you need to write just a short reflection essay for each of the 4 questions. By short, I mean less than 3,000 words. So significantly less. In America, you've been through it before. It's not designed to hurt. And if you get that done, so it's going to be released in the morning of the 9th before classes, before the day starts. So it'll actually be released December 8th, close to midnight, so that everybody has access to it going into finals week. You'll have access to it all 5 days of finals, and then it will close on midnight, the 13th, Friday the 13th. If you want to get it done as soon as you see it on Monday, you can get it done. And if you're missing anything, I will grade it right away, and then you'll have an opportunity to turn around and fix it and resubmit. So it's a benefit to get it done at the beginning of the finals week, if you can. It also gets it out of the way. It's not difficult. I'm not asking you to remember things that you learned during the process of the course. It is basically 4 questions that are designed to have you reflect and share your thoughts about your process of learning through the course of the semester. And that's pretty much what that final is. We are going to be meeting next week, but next week we are going to be meeting on Tuesday rather than Thursday, because all of you for Thursday will be involved in Thanksgiving. So we're not going to be meeting then. All right, so that's what the rest of the term is going to look like, or the rest of the semester. Now, the last couple of weeks, we've talked about art getting into the present day. And oh no, okay, I forgot. The other thing is weekly reflection as a video. Let me share. I'm going to open that page up, and I want you, and we're going to talk about that as well. And then I'll launch into the stuff. Okay. All right. I added this to the weekly reflection assignment. And next week, I hope you guys show up. I want you to talk to me about what you thought when I introduced this, and if you decided to do it, how you felt about it. Because last week, if you remember, I said weekly reflections, I wanted to try a video submission. And this just talks about the format of the video submission. So it's required to be 3 to 5 minutes long. It must be recorded as an MOV, MP4, or WAV file. And it must include images of what you are reflecting on, which must be from that week's module. So, any of the images within the module you can go on. And the format will be, and if you don't get the Teams recording to work, you can do this with your phone while your phone is pointed towards the computer screen. Doesn't matter, but the format will be that the image is going to show up on the screen, and you're going to do a voiceover, and you're recording your voiceover so we can see the image that you're looking at. And you're going to be applying all 4 tools of artistic critique. And if you do need citations, you must have them typed into a separate document, which you will also submit with the MOV, MP4, or WAV video file at the same time you submit it. I don't think you need the citations, and I'll explain why. If you are doing a screenshot of something that you saw in the module while we were going through the module, then you really don't need a separate citation because you're not referring to an exterior source. Okay, if you want to bring stuff up outside of the class, that's fine. Then that's when you would need to do a citation. And I wanted to talk about the 4 tools of artistic critique and remind everybody what they are, because that's what you're going to use in this video. Well, you should be using that in all the weekly reflections, but that's what you're going to use particularly in this video format, weekly reflection. And the tools of artistic critique, there's 4 of them. Do you guys remember what the first one is? It starts with a D. Description. That's right. You talk about the physical impact of the thing that you're referencing. And if you're doing something that's a Rothko painting or Sol DeWitt exercise or Joseph Kosuth 1 in 3 chairs, you'll show an image of that. And the first step, you'll be describing what you see, just like we did the other day when we were talking about conceptual art. Do you remember what the second tool is that you apply?
Analyze.
Analyze, that's right. And this is where we talk about how do we think the artist made it? What did they do? So for the 1 in 3 chairs, example where we talk about setting the chair up and photographing it, or that he went and selected a wood folding chair, or that maybe he went to a print shop and printed up the definition in a large scale so he could mount it to the wall. What's the third step or the third tool of artistic critique?
Interpretation.
Interpretation, exactly. And in that, am I loud enough? You guys can hear me, right? Okay. Interpretation, this you may want to go to outside sources. Find more out about the artist whose work you're looking at. Like this week we are looking at work from one of my very favorite artists in the world, Kara Walker. I think she's absolutely astounding. And there's a lot of articles um, outside of the class where people interviewed her about her influences. And if you want to go into that, um, then that's when you would reference it and make a citation. But like I said, if you don't use materials that are outside of the module, you don't need to have a citation for it. You just need to reference what's in the module. And all this time, the image of what you're talking about is front and center in your screen share. Right. So, and interpret, you're talking about what it means to you, what it could mean to the artist, what maybe they were thinking when they were doing it, or what you might extrapolate what they were thinking, all those kinds of ideas. And then what's the fourth step?
Evaluate.
Evaluate. And do you remember what you do in the fourth step?
You look over the art and think about how it impacts you.
Yeah, you talk about its impact. You talk about whether or not it's successful. So yeah, excellent. And each of those will take at minimum 45 seconds. If you do it faster than that, go back and do it again. And what I would recommend if you're confident that you can fit the time requirement without an issue, go ahead and do it. But it might be good to sit down, jot some notes down about what you want to talk about, and then looking at the artwork, you say out loud what you want to say to a roommate or a friend or a family member and have them time you. And that way you'll know if you've gone too long or too short. And if it's too short, look at the Tools of Artistic Critique page and look at the different questions that I've listed there, and then just ask those questions to yourself. And you'll find in the process of answering those questions while you're looking at this object, you will be able to comfortably uh, meet the time requirement. And then when you're all done, stop the recording, leave the meeting, and save it as a file. Now, do you guys know how to save it on Teams? Save it as a video on Teams? Okay. Um, Jenny, you know how to. America, not some, you don't. Okay, so what you'll do is if you go to your Teams calendar, and I can't get to that because if I do, I'll leave the meeting. But do you know what your Teams calendar looks like? If you the setup that you have on the left-hand side, there are about 9 icons or so, and the fifth one down says calendar. And can you see that, America? Okay, you click on that once, not right now, but you click on that once, and after you've done, that will take you to a calendar page. After you've done your meeting, you can schedule it and set it up on there, and then go ahead and record it. After you've done, you'll see a block of time that represents the block, that is the block of time that you set aside for this short Teams meeting. And you can put it in your calendar for an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever you want, even though you're only going to be talking for 3 minutes, because it's yours and you have complete control over it. So after you're all done, after you've recorded it and you've hit the stop record and you've left your meeting, go to the calendar, back to the calendar page, double click on that square, or yeah, double click on that square, and you will see a couple different things. And one at the top, it'll say, I believe, um, chat. And if you touch on that, um, okay, hold on a sec. I'm going to see if I can. Okay. I think I can show you how to do this. And it'll be recorded so everybody can see it. Okay. All right. Do you see this page? And you'll have to say it out loud if you're answering, because I can't see you when I'm sharing this one. Can you see this page?
Yes.
Okay. And then right here, you go down, fourth or fifth one is the calendar. Click on that. And then it will show you the box. And you can, the way to set these up is you left click here on an arrow, or you click on a time period that's about when you want to do your meeting. And then you give it the time that you want to do the meeting, say it's only for you. And it's pretty self-explanatory. But if you do have an issue, you can contact the Canvas support people on campus, and they'll walk you through it. So you have the calendar like this, and then if you tap it once, it shows you that. You tap it twice, and it takes you to this page. Can you see this new page?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And right up here where it says chat, you'll hit that. And then this, about 10 minutes after your meeting is done, you'll see this. And if you have a recorded transcript, it'll show up as well. But you'll see this box. See, and this box, it has a screenshot from the video. It says recording, has your name on it, and then it says this. A lot of times it will say this has an expiration date. But you see these three dots right here?
Yes.
You click on that, and then you go up to open in stream. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. You click that, and it opens up a new page. And this page will have a screenshot from the video, but then you go up here and you see these three dots here.
Yes.
Okay. You click those three dots and it will show you download. And that's how you get to the download. All right. You guys got that? And you can go back and watch that a couple times, but that's how you get to it. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then, and that download, when it downloads, it will download it as, I think that the default is MP4. I think. Let me trying to find it here. The default download file is that's weird. I wonder why. Okay, it's MP4. The team system for Utah Tech, the default download file is MP4. All right, and then once you download it, you can do whatever you want with it, retitle it to make sense. But that is the easiest way to save a file that is a recording of your Zoom conversation with yourself. You guys follow that? Make sense? Okay. So today, as our last like official artsy fartsy module, I want to talk about the impact and relationship that art has on memory and history and how these things are kind of fit together. Or before we do that, do you guys have any questions about the stuff we just finished talking about?
So for next week, we're meeting at the same time on Tuesday.
Right.
Okay.
And as soon as we get off this call, I will make that change. And then for the rest of the term, we're still going to be meeting on Thursdays. And if you guys want to, we'll meet on Thursday during the finals week too, but that is not going to be a part of your attendance at all. I don't really want to meet on Thursday during finals week. There's no reason to, because your final will be taken as an assignment, like I just showed you. Okay. So this module talks about history and memory, and there is a difference. There is a very significant difference. I think memory, for the most part, is going to be a lot more personal than history, and history references documentation, and so it's given more weight as opposed to just memory. And it's not, and it doesn't have to be actual facts. Like this story, I remember this. I used to work for a studio, a stained glass studio up north, and the owner of the studio, when he was in high school, he swam all the time. And so when he and his brother were in high school, they swam across the Utah Lake. And at the time, it was a really big deal. Well, somebody was writing a history book about Utah County and wanted to talk to these to the two brothers who had swum across Utah Lake, and contacted the owner of the studio and sat down for with the conversation. And I had heard the story so many times. It was him and his brother. They started off in the morning in a rowboat. His dad was in the rowboat. They covered their bodies with Vaseline so that they'd stay warm. They would go across, and every once in a while they would pause and kind of tread water while their dad was in the boat and stuff. And he would spur them on by telling them they were being idiots for staying in the cold water too long. Just, and that's the story. And then when they got to the other side, there was so much algae near the banks of Utah Lake, because it's so shallow, that algae would get caught in the Vaseline that they had rubbed all over themselves. So when they emerged, they looked like creatures in the Black Lagoon, except they were all green with the algae that had stuck to them. And they had puffy eyes from the algae getting in there. They were feeling kind of gross and crappy afterwards, but they were total chick magnets when they were done, because it was in the newspaper. Well, so I knew all about that. This historian sat down, and my boss at the time told the whole story to the historian, just like I told you. The historian was taking notes. And about 8 months later, the book was getting published, and he said, "Hey, you want a copy?" And he gave a copy to my boss at the time. And we looked at the story, and the story was not anything like what had been told to the historian, or like what I had been told, or what he had experienced. It wasn't like that. The historian had conflated two different stories. The younger brother had died in the meantime, and he had managed to work that in somewhere, even though the young man had died a good 15 years after graduating high school. Somehow it was a tragedy connected to the swimming across the lake when they were both in high school. And it wasn't his dad, it was his mom in the rowboat. But it was just several of the points identifying the story were completely bogus. But what was published was now the history. And I think that is kind of an interesting thing that happens, and it happens a lot. Can you imagine, or can you guys think of any situations where what actually happened was not recorded and is not the actual history? And when the history that's recorded doesn't have a lot of relationship necessarily to what actually happened? Can you think of any things like that? or any instances where that has happened? Well, the first thing that comes to what's that?
I can
America?
mainly think of like circumstances where, but it's during an event is happening, then people are spreading around that something specific is going on, but it ends up in the end, once the whole situation is resolved, that it's not, that certain things didn't happen. It was completely something else.
Yeah, and sometimes, like with natural disasters, that can happen when uh, people will blame something on the natural disaster when it had nothing to do with it. An example of that was I don't know how familiar you guys are with LDS culture. It's a big thing in this state, but there is a temple in an LDS temple in South Carolina that is in the western part of South Carolina. And here in Utah, everybody was excited that all the tropical storms passed it by and didn't cause any damage to it. So obviously, God was protecting the temple. And I am being slightly sarcastic to this, but the reality is the temple was 400 miles away from the coastline. And there was no way that a hurricane or tropical storm would have impacted it at all, ever. So the miracle of protection was in uh, just the universal application of natural thermodynamics. You know, it wasn't something that was startlingly miraculous, but it became that way because of misperceptions. Is that kind of like what you're talking about, America, where it's just something is reported, but it's not at all the way it happened? And the another thing that I was thinking about was when Moses was writing Genesis, there is no way that Genesis could be an actual history. You know, he was a priest of Egypt, and so he was educated in astronomy and math. The Egyptians knew the universe was extraordinarily old. And so Moses is trying in one chapter in a Bible that's supposed to teach people moral lessons. He's talking about the physics and physical processes of the previous 17 billion years of the universe's growth. You know, and so how else is he going to describe the Big Bang, but with God saying, "Let there be light"? Do you see what I'm saying? So in a couple of verses, he's describing 16 billion years. And history is like that all the time. Yeah, Jenny.
The other flip side to it too is when you talk about like heritage, when you hear the story of like your great great grandpappy, slew a bear or slayed a bear and he lost his arm or whatever, and it became like part of your family's history. And I'm not talking about like oral history with cultures. I'm talking about like you hear a story from your grandparents and it passes down and it's the
Right,
meaning or the story slightly changes. So
right.
heritage also has a huge influence on this topic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see really quickly how these ideas of memory and history just get all mixed up. And it's interesting to me because, like with exactly what Jenny's talking about, those kind of family histories, people are emotionally invested in them being true. And if it doesn't fit or doesn't fit the right way with documented things, then the documentation must be off or the family's upset. And and a lot of this kind of conflation and abrasiveness comes because people get emotionally attached or emotionally distanced from things that may or may not have happened. What I've noticed is when I was in fifth grade, I went to my elementary was Sacagawea Elementary. So I grew up knowing that Sacagawea was an awesome lady. The coolest moment or the coolest period where I could see that the federal government had done something worthwhile was the Sacagawea dollar. Here is this woman. She was functionally a single mom. Her husband stayed at their home when she went and was a guide to Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark were commissioned by, um, he built Monticello. Who's the president who built Monticello? Monticello. His second wife was black, Sally. Thomas Jefferson. That's it. Okay. Thomas Jefferson commissioned Lewis and Clark to find a way to the west coast of this continent, but more importantly, find and document as much as they could evidence of pre-Spanish infiltration into North America. That was the big thing that they were doing, pre-Spanish colonization. And since Sacagawea, she was an explorer. She knew everything. She knew she could speak and communicate in like a dozen different languages. And she got pregnant. No, she got pregnant before she went on the trail, and so she had to give birth while she was out with these two guys, and ended up carrying her baby with her. But a lot of this stuff, I don't know how much of it was actual history or how much of it was, the hero worship type of tales that were given as kids to encourage us to respect and admire these people that were truly remarkable people. In her case, a lot of the stories are actually even more fantastic than what made the history books. Sadly, and I'm going to be blunt, I hope I don't offend anybody who watches this video, and I hope nobody gets really upset, but after the European conquest of North America, and just the European conquest of the Americas in general, it seems that the people with melanin in their skin, just their version of history and reality was just either not worth mentioning or was completely bulldozed over by the European colonist perceptions, and with very little respect given. And what is exciting to me is that in the last 40 years, I have seen more and more people, melanated people in North and South America, who have claimed their heritage and gone through the European colonial system or the colonizing European system of education to get their degrees and stuff. They're fully accredited, so they can stand toe to toe with any of the European colonizers. And they are using those credentials to demonstrate to the world what the actual history is. And that is exciting to me, because it is one thing to have a Rapa Nui say, well, no, we walked the Easter Island heads, we carved them off a cliff and we walked them to the sites they're at. Nobody's going to believe them. But when a Rapa Nui gets educated in mainland European styled university and comes back with PhDs out the wazoo and is able to get grants from governments to help demonstrate his theories regarding how the Easter Island head bodies were moved, and he's able to show it and put it on YouTube using all those tools, now history has changed. The reality was always there, but now people recognize that the Rapa Nui actually do know what they're talking about when they're talking about their own culture. And I think that's exciting to me, because Winston Churchill said history is written by the winners, essentially. It's actually I think that it's more correct to say history is written by the ones with the best publishers. But it typically, we accept it as reality, even though it is the perspective of whoever published. And that's it. But there is definitely a very powerful weight given to history over memory and over, like what Jenny was saying, tradition. Even though they are all reflecting different aspects of reality. And that is an interesting philosophical conversation, But isn't it interesting that we've gotten to a point with art that today we can actually address these philosophical ideas, and not only address these ideas, but we can actually correct the inadequacies that just the weight and momentum of centuries has done disservice to. Now, were you guys aware that there were 17th century witch trials during the 1600s? You guys have read The Crucible, right? You've read The
I haven't
Crucible.
read
You know
it, but my high school that I graduated from actually did the play like 2 years ago.
oh, okay.
Um,
So
yeah,
you know about the witch trials in Salem, in Massachusetts.
yeah,
Were you aware
yeah.
about
It
the
was
witch
horrible,
trials?
horrible times.
Oh, yeah. Were you aware that there were witch trials in Connecticut at the same time?
Yeah, there's also witch trials going on in England and Europe around the same time period too.
Well, what is interesting to me is that nobody knew about the Connecticut witch trials until 2007. And the reason is that the Connecticut families, the Connecticut governments, the regional governments that were involved, when they came to their senses, were so shocked and disgusted by what they had done that they destroyed all public records. So the only records that were left were journals of people that lived through it. And what is interesting is somebody came across these in the 90s and started compiling them, and then was finally able to bring this out to the public in 2007. And now it is an official part of Connecticut state history. But yeah, Jenny's absolutely right. There were witch trials that happened all over the place, but it's fascinating to me that it was not part of official Connecticut history. So of course, quote unquote, big foam finger air quotes, it did not happen because it was not part of the history. And it was only by getting into those family stories and finding documentation through family journals, accessing people's memories, that they were able to, that the Connecticut government was able to find out about this. And they started a process, just like in Massachusetts. Do you remember they've been doing the uh, posthumous exonerations of all the people, all the women and men that were convicted of witchcraft, practicing witchcraft. Do you remember this? Massachusetts did the posthumous exonerations as a state for everybody that was executed of witchcraft. They exonerated them, and Connecticut then did the same thing. Isn't that interesting? I think that's absolutely fantastic. So where does art come into this? And one of the reasons why I love Yinka Shonibara and Kara Walker is because these are artists that consistently will not re-envision history, but relay history and things that actually happen that maybe we're not aware of in such a way that we really see it in a completely different light. Now, I don't know if you're aware of it, but there were heroes of the American Revolution, for example, that have all been historically portrayed as Caucasian Europeans, when in historical fact, it was there were people like Jean Lafitte, who came over here from France and helped with that American Revolutionary Navy. In his family tree were Black Africans. There were a number of consultants who were they dressed in European style clothes, but they were indigenous Americans that were educated in European style educational settings as well, so they could hold their own toe to toe with the European settlers in any sort of academic setting. And culture, they were part of two cultures, but both of these groups of people have been portrayed as Caucasians. And I found out about this when I was one of my very favorite musicals. Can you guess what I'm leading up to? Which is my favorite musical? It has King George in it. It has rap in it.
Are you talking about Hamilton?
Yes. It is leading up to that. The people who put that together were absolutely brilliant because they were able to demonstrate the activity and emotion of the time in a very contemporary, using a very contemporary visual vocabulary. So, at the time, there were an extraordinarily high percentage of the participants who were European Caucasians, but they were from all sorts of countries and social classes that viewed each other in many cases as other than entirely human sometimes. And that kind of energy of excited people seeking to break boundaries, working together, I think was really captured very well in the musical. I was also thinking about this in regards to Star Trek, and I feel that I have kind of betrayed my responsibility as a teacher at Utah Tech for not bringing in either Star Trek or Star Wars into absolutely every module, and I'm sorry about that. But I remember, when I was a little kid, I grew up watching Star Trek. It was Star Trek and the Bible. Those were the formative things. I remember it being so incredibly exciting. And then when my kids got to the right age, I was trying to show them these old episodes to get them hooked on it. And they just weren't that interested until they got a little bit older, until they got to be about 12, 13. Then they started getting really interested. And, or they started getting interested. And then they thought it was fantastic when the newly digitized versions came out. But still, it wasn't the same excitement that I had felt when I was a kid watching them. And then J.J. Abrams revisited Star Trek in today's contemporary visual vocabulary, just like the musical Hamilton. And suddenly it was as exciting to today's viewing audience as the original series was to me as a kid, way long years ago when the Earth's crust was still cooling. And I think somewhere in all that, there's connections with tradition. There's connections with how we remember things, as well as art. So a lot of history today can be really dry, but I think you need to have an artistic sensibility to bring a lot of things together so that people can feel the same kind of or a similar energy as the people that were living that history at the time. Something to think about. Now, have you guys heard of the Mandela Effect?
Yeah.
Okay, this talks quite a bit about. I was mentioning how European-styled, educated indigenous people were changing the face of anthropology and history here in the Americas. What is really interesting to me is when I started researching, I had heard about the Mandela Effect, and when I started researching it, I was astonished by what was going on. Those people I referenced, the anthropologists that are reevaluating history, they're not creating anything. What they're doing is bringing the reality that existed in the past forward so we can understand, appreciate, and in part experience it today. So they're bringing the real forward and getting rid of misapprehensions and misunderstandings. The Mandela Effect is almost the opposite. On this page, you'll see there's several different articles and a few different videos I want you to look at. what is really fascinating to me, and then William Shatner talks a whole lot about memory manipulation. Documentation is not changed very much. You know, it's written down, it stays there, and the written word was used by Europeans to kind of um, a number of other different cultures too, like the Maya use it in the same way, as well as the Qin, Chinese cultures since Emperor Qin, as well as India, the Indus Valley cultures did the same thing. Egyptian cultures, really big. When it's written down, you know, it's documented. It's unchanging. Well, that's even though that's what was believed, that's not true. There is an island in the middle of the Nile where, as new dynasties would take over in ancient Egypt, they would take the records that they couldn't adapt to their own uh, needs or their own story, and they would root them up and throw them on this island. It became a graveyard for history. And it's interesting because a lot of Egyptian anthropologists that focus on Egyptian history are learning that the history that we think we know now is sometimes very different than what actually happened, because each subsequent family that took over changed the documentation of the previous families. So the memories that were desired overtook documented history. What the Mandela Effect talks about is this is the idea that um, documentation as it exists today sometimes is incompatible with our own memories of documentation as it was in times before. And what this is, some people have concluded that this means we live in an intersection of multiple universes, where we have memories sometimes of occurrences that were true in different places that we lived in, that were actually different frequencies of existence, which I think is really interesting. But a lot of the times, I think it can be demonstrated. Even though I've experienced this, I know you guys have had Mandela Effect experiences yourself, haven't you? Do you know what I'm
all the
talking about? Yeah. And what is actually going on more often than not, I really hope sometimes it's because we do remember a portion of our existence in a parallel universe. That'd be so freakishly awesome. But a lot of the times it can be demonstrated that what's really going on is our brain is constantly seeking ways to catalog information so we can exist better and more happily. What that means is our brains are designed so that if we have a memory, every time we think about that memory, it overwrites it with that new memory of us thinking about that memory, with the associated responses and emotions that occurred at the moment that we were thinking about that memory again. And this happens every time we relive a memory. And what that comes to be is this memory that we've thought about 20 or 30 times that we think is the same memory has actually been changed 20 or 30 times because it gets slightly changed with whatever emotional state we were in, whatever we were experiencing, whatever else we were thinking about every time we revisit that memory. And then that new memory overwrites the previous one. Do you see what I'm saying? It's this, and a lot of the times, if we refresh our memory by revisiting the original triggers, or we wrote something down when we first experienced it, then that writing, every time we go back to it, that writing helps us to remember something similar and more approximate to what that original memory was. That's a way to kind of maintain that. Or if we just straight out memorize it. The Australian indigenous Australians and the griots of West Africa are absolutely astonishingly extraordinary in their capacity for memorization. And they keep cultural memories alive. Griots are so dependable that a contract written 150 years ago will be memorized word for word, and a 12-year-old who's a professional griot can recite it to you today. 150-year-old contract. And stuff like that is just astonishing to me. Indigenous Australians, in their verbal histories remember astronomical events that happened 50,000 years before. And I think I've mentioned that. But for the most part, these kind of fluxes and just the way that memory works goes a long way in explaining sometimes how the Mandela effect happens. And William Shatner's The Unexplained, he actually interviews some people that study what I was just saying and describe it really well. So are all of your memories real? What's fascinating is that sometimes when there's somebody that we have an emotional attachment to, positive or negative, things that they remember, we can take those stories and either take the stories as we heard it from them or extrapolate their experience, and then over time translate that to become our own memory too. Now, what does all this have to do with art? And what is fascinating to me is there are a number of artists that use these new, contemporary processes to demonstrate different ways of thinking about these kinds of things, histories, memory, Mandela effect, all this kind of stuff. And Doris Salcedo, she does these things that are visual. They're basically video presentations, where in the video presentation, it'll look like it's a garbage dump or a pile of refuse, and actually the refuse, each element of the refuse represents either an historical event or a memory that a participant has. And, and it symbolizes that. And she shows it in different ways. So you get this idea that not that we're necessarily brains filled with garbage, but we do operate with a whole lot of symbols of things that connect to history and memory. And there's a couple really interesting articles that I want you to read, and then this talks specifically about the difference between history and memory. And what I love about Doris's work is a lot of the time she's doing stuff that is really difficult to deal with. And if she showed you the actual events, you would not believe that such terrible things would actually be possible. But by doing it in this way, she is able to help you to distance emotionally from this and begin to recognize that actual people did experience these terrible things. And then by allowing you to distance yourself and giving you time to process the little elements of the harsh reality that you're visited, it gets to the point where Doris ends up opening a door so you can actually understand and appreciate what did happen, get to the point where you can respect the people that survived it, and even go through a process of reconciliation. And really, really interesting. And Din Q. Lee is absolutely amazing because he makes collages and does other things like this too. But he does all these things where he creates environments and installations that very much fit the concept of contemporary work, conceptual work, things like this. But he's dealing with the ideas of memories and what both America and what Jenny, you talked about. Now, this is interesting, and I'm going to pull in on it a little bit. What he did here is he took historical photos of a Tibetan or a Buddhist shrine and put them together in a large format image. And then he took contemporary photos of what the place looks like right now and the area around it. He cut them into strips and then wove them together. And that's what you're seeing. This is why it looks the way it is, because the horizontal strips are from the original historical shrine, and the vertical strips that you see intersecting them are from the contemporary photos that he took using the same color palette. And it's really interesting to me because he demonstrates that sometimes the memories we want to have and the memories that we live within today can be a disquieting diffusion of the actual history. And sometimes the past can come in and help us to understand our contemporary life. But do you guys see what he's doing there in that image? Isn't that fascinating? Can you see what he's doing? Kind of weaving the two things together. I think that kind of thing is really intriguing. Now, one of the people that I really love, one of my favorite artists, is Shirin Neshat. And this is when we start talking about personal memory, personal experience, and broader historical narratives. How does the personal memory fit in to broader history? Now, I think a lot of people think that they know the history of Iran for everything that's important, at least. But Shirin Neshat, she was born in Iran under the Shahs, and when the Ayatollahs took over and changed the government, she's in a position now where she can't go back to Iran. Now she's permanently in exile. She addresses a lot of the intersections between what Iran was actually like while the Shahs were there, and what Iran was actually like in during the Cultural Revolution. She talks about her personal memories and her personal experiences, and how sometimes that's the same, and how sometimes it's different from the historical narrative. And she does this using images that are really impactful. She writes poetry. She's also a poet, but she writes poetry with red and black ink, either on the faces of models or on the photos after she takes the images. And what her body of work has become is viewing these two different kinds of worlds, a Republican Iran and a religious government Iran, with its impact on the expectations of women in society, historically and today, her own experience, and the experience of women that she actually knows that have lived through things parallel to her experience. And she kind of puts all that together in her series that she does. And it's really fascinating stuff. And then I talked about Carol Walker. She talks about this is one of the things that's kind of interesting to me. She says of herself, I am an unreliable narrator. Because Carol Walker is a Black American. She confronts the history of slavery in the United States head on. She doesn't flinch from it. And a lot of her stuff is very difficult to experience because can be really, really harsh. She's absolutely brilliant and she's absolutely fearless. But even though she creates things that installations, sculptures, all sorts of different kinds of stuff, and a lot of these are very emotionally powerful and very difficult to get through, at the end, you feel like you've peeled off a scab. And it feels very healing. Now, she calls herself an unreliable narrator because she does reference history, but she references what actually happened as well from the perspective of Black Americans. People born on the African continent who were forcibly extracted from their homes, visited with unspeakable tortures, and treated with less respect than chickens when they got here to the U.S. And it's so her stuff can be very difficult to deal with, but it is incredibly powerful. And I've already talked about Shirin Neshat. But that the image at the beginning of the module, I'm going to get back to that really quick, is one of Kara Walker's pieces. And we talked about Betty Saar I think 2 weeks ago. So Kara Walker, this is her subtly or a marvelous sugar baby. It is a sphinx done to the same size of the sphinx in Egypt that everybody knows is famous, but it is made out of sugar, uh, sugar from the fields in this area where slavery was a real thing, and it is done with features from the stereotypical female slave of the mid to early 19th century. And it is something, she calls herself an unreliable narrator because she takes these things that actually did happen and she passes them through her own artistic vocabulary and puts her own emotions into it and her own perspective into it. And I think she has been criticized an awful lot by people who feel that she is changing history to her own agenda, which I think is really sad, because that is the purview of absolutely every artist who's ever lived everywhere, anywhere, throughout all time. They've always done things according to their own perspective. And that's what Kara Walker does too. And she is absolutely astonishing. But I would not do it if you are in a very fragile state of mind and you don't want to feel have any negative emotions. Stay away from her work until you feel stronger. Now, I want to share something else, and this is a genre that has been increasingly popular. It first shows up in science fiction in the 30s as people start getting an idea that maybe time travel would be a thing with all this new technology that people have. But it is the idea of the manipulation of time. Do you guys know what this movie is? I'm so disappointed in you. Time Cop, Jean-Claude Van Damme. One of the best bad science fiction movies about time travel ever. And it has Jean-Claude Van Damme in it. It's actually a fun movie to watch. Have you guys heard about the Tartarian civilization? I'm sorry, hold on just a second. I'm checking out something, changing it. There we go. Okay. Have either of you heard about the Tartarian civilization? It is something that starts showing up about 15 years ago, and I include the link to this video here. But I really like you to check it out. It's kind of fun, but it's the idea that there was an entire civilization that was buried, literally buried in Russia and in the Western U.S. and where its evidences were. It was literally buried between about 1870 and 1890, and was forcibly removed from all the history books so that it disappeared completely by about 1910 into the right before the First World War. It looks to me that this idea of Tartaria started as a thought experiment by somebody who was really thinking about what is that relationship between history and memory, and not just that, but how do we manipulate and distort historical narratives? And it seems to me that that's kind of what started as a process, and then this person who began it with the internet, people were saying, "Oh, this is out of context. I wonder if it's linked to the Tartarian civilization. And over time, it grew to the point where now there are people that have written books about the history of Tartaria, or the Tartarians. It is entirely plausible that if world governments could agree on anything to the point where they could actually pool their resources, world governments could effectively remove the actual events from history around the world. That's already happened. It's happened several times. One example is just the history of racism in the U.S., in the United States. Race, as we understand it now, wasn't really a thing until about, I think it's about 1712, 1725, when the first articles started appearing in colonial newspapers talking about blacks being an inferior race and the separation between blacks and whites. And the reason why there's three people that define critical race theory in the United States, and they've written extensively about this. But looking at the historical record, the people that came to the U.S., there were basically three groups. The people that came here and developed an owning relationship with property, the people that came here as indentured servants, who the cost of their travel and living was contained in a contract that could be bought and sold. That contract could, so that landowners here in North America could effectively buy the contract of the indentured servant and keep them using part of their wages to pay off that contract, which with slightly different terminology, it was white slavery. And then you get the remaining group, which was people that were bought and sold on the continent of Africa and then forcibly relocated here and treated as property here as well. Those two groups of non-owners, the white indentured servants and the black slaves, were both in the same boat. The difference was that the black slaves, their children were considered property of their owners as well. But for the most part, the children of the white indentured servants were not considered covered by the contracts that have been bought. And when these two groups of people really started communicating with each other towards the end of the 17th century, so from about 1670 on forward, there started becoming a growing concern for white European landowners. And that's when you see at the first part of the 18th century, articles started getting published telling everybody that there was a factual difference between skin color races. And that's when racism, as we understand it together, the fiction of racism was invented, which it's kind of interesting to me. And this is just a total aside. It's a fiction that has become a reality. It was an invented difference that now people believe is a real thing, and it functions as a real thing. But what is interesting to me is that marks a point in time when history was specifically manipulated through the Enlightenment era to demonstrate that in the Bible, racism was supported and encouraged, and that expanded to a huge portion of most of society in Europe and North America. This expanding idea of melanin-inspired racism, and so it took about 80 years, but history actually was changed, and to the point where now. This is one thing that's fascinating to me. Today, you tell people things like this, that actually there's documented evidence that it actually happened. There's documentation that demonstrates that people were actually doing it on purpose, and still people don't believe it. and which is astonishing. And can you think of anything like that where history actually was changed um, more recently, perhaps on a smaller scale? One of the things that I'm thinking of is the Weinstein things that have been going on. Um, I think it was, is it Harvey Weinstein or Harold Weinstein, something like that. Um, the history was that he was a really powerful producer in Hollywood and everybody owed their livelihood to him. And then it started coming out that there were a significant dozens and dozens of people that talk about how poorly he had treated them and used them as individuals. And now, as an individual, he's completely discredited. And it's interesting because people look back and blame the folks that didn't notice anything because they see it through a lens of today. And that happens quite a bit a lot of the time, where people they'll learn about injustices done in the past and hold those people to a standard of knowledge that we have today because we can see in a broader scope what was going on. And so we now do you see what I'm kind of talking about in that instance where and that becomes really problematic because we can harbor resentment for somebody that essentially functioned as a being of their time, which can be really sad and discouraging. But another example, yeah, Jenny.
I just had the thought of when we were talking about Hamilton the musical, there's this other one called Six, and it's basically this whole musical about Henry VIII's wives, his six wives, and it's this whole musical about their lives and actually what happened versus like what the normal narrative of, oh, they were just Henry's wives, they didn't do anything. But the musical is really interesting because it's really diving into, well, actually this is me as a person, not because. And so
Right.
they're like changing the narrative, and it's a really interesting concept that people are looking at the historical narratives, and they're researching and they're finding new facts, and so that therefore they're changing the perceived narrative.
Yeah, and that is a really good point. And this is something that I love that art does, because the art is in the creating the musical and the presentation of the musical. But what that does is opens up a doorway into your mind so you can kind of appreciate that these people are living expanded lives other than the half a sentence written about them from Henry VIII's perspective, for an example. And there are some things that I think are just astonishing like that, where history is expanded. Some of the videos that I have you guys look at, they're all like just a couple minutes long, talking with a couple of historians that say history is not fixed in any way, shape, or form. Uh, Say that history is in flux all the time because of exactly what Jenny's talking about. But our perception is that history is written. Nobody wants to keep doing a new edition of the book every 15 minutes when something else is discovered. And there are things that that we learn now, or we find, like Jenny was referencing family history, when that dovetails with other people's experiences, and then you realize that should be put into the historical canon of information as well. Um, that can really expand how we view our fellows and the world and historical events. And it becomes really an interesting um, influx. I want to see if I can find or a really interesting conflagration of information. Let's see. I want to show you something. There was a guy who was, he really invented the whole genre of documentary photography. And what I want to show you is, I'm just going to show you a quick photograph. Quick question. Who was the most photographed celebrity in the 19th century? Do you guys know? And this relates directly to this whole memory and history section. It was Frederick Douglass. He was an escaped slave that was eventually emancipated, but the guy was absolutely brilliant, freakishly brilliant. And as soon as photography came on the scene, that actually became the fastest growing cottage industry for freed Black American families in the Midwest and northern U.S., setting up photography studios. But Frederick Douglass said the photograph is astounding because it allows you the opportunity to present yourself to the world in a permanent state in the same manner as heads of state historically, that has previously only belonged to heads of state. And but there's always been at that point in time this kind of gravity associated with the portrait, and photography was seen as a portraiture form. And so when we look at this where we see a Chinese family and people laughing or smiling like this. I showed this in a class and somebody said, "Oh, that's complete racism." You know, it's like 1950s era racism, Chinese misrepresentation trope kind of thing, because you get the laughing or the smiling Chinese person. But what was interesting is that when the father of documentary photography went to China to start his career, the people in China did not know that you were supposed to be really solemn in your professional portraits. And so a lot of people were smiling. And we look at photographs from the Americas at the same time, everybody's, stern and stuff like that. Yeah, they had to sit for a minute, but America, I've been watching you. You can hold a smile for at least 3 minutes at a time. And Jenny, so can you. So even though the person had to sit there for a minute and a half during the processing of the plate, they could have smiled. But they didn't, because it was culturally appropriate to be solemn. It was a portrait after all. And in China, they did not have that cultural expectation. Isn't that interesting? So another of the artists who deals with, I'm going to show you a couple artists that deal with these kinds of ideas. This William Kentridge, I really appreciate, because William Kentridge, he's from South Africa, and he does a lot of this kind of revisiting history, readjusting history, reforming what history should potentially be, more hopeful interpretations, dealing with the bald truth like Carol Walker does, from a very personal perspective, because he almost always shows himself in the imagery that he does. And he does animation, he does drawings, he does large-scale performance pieces, all sorts of different stuff. And he's a really fun person to look at, so definitely check that out. Ai Weiwei, have you guys heard of him? Ai Weiwei is a Chinese artist. He was critical of the Chinese government, so was not allowed back to China for a long time. Now he does a lot of his work calling attention to like Syrian refugees being forced to go to Greece, and how they're treated in getting there, and how the Syrian refugees are treated, and how refugees from the continent of Africa as a whole are treated differently than any other group of refugees. But Ai Weiwei does a lot of artwork, some of it's performance, some of it's sculptural, some of it's architectural, where he deals with the purposeful misleading and misinterpretation of history, or the complete disrespect of history. Like one of his pieces is a short film where it's just him dropping a literally priceless Ming Dynasty vase because he's so appalled by how few Chinese people know their own history and how that has impacted their lack of criticism on foreign affairs. And it's just really interesting. And I like Walid Rod is a person who works a lot with this idea of separating elements out of history and demonstrating them out of context by doing things that are kind of contemporary takes on museum displays. Like for this is a selection of crates, and each of them have a silhouette cutout of what could possibly have been shipped in that crate to whatever museum or storage facility it's going to. And a lot of these are going to be informed by historical perceptions. A lot of them, like these, are historical floral designs or botanical specimens, or they are also sometimes informed by the fantasies done on historical documents. Like monsters like this would try to be reproduced by people who would make maps later from the really bad journal depictions that people would have of whatever they encountered. So some interesting things. Like some of the sea monsters that we see on map edges may very well have been people trying to describe how a pod of whale or dolphins look like as they swim. And this is another one of my favorite artists, Yinka Shonobara. Absolutely amazing. But when he does things like this. If you look at this, the layout of this, the little boy, the child sitting on the back of a chair with a little telescope is right out of a 1950s, 1960s era European or American publication about the precociousness, typically the 10 to 12-year-old boy. And what Yinke is doing is taking that kind of trope image that is from countless magazines during the 1950s and 1960s. He makes a mannequin. The head is replaced by a globe, and the skin is this flesh that shows is a skin tone that is not abrasive, but it's not entirely natural. So it allows whoever views it to put themselves in this or put people that they know in this, because it's not quite it's not at all a distinct individual. And then the clothing, what do you notice about the pattern of the cloth? A lot of those patterns are traditional, I'm not going to say traditional, but they are very contemporary patterns that come out of countries like Ghana and Nigeria. Very colorful, beautiful patterns that are designed by designers in the African continent. And so what he's doing is updating a 1950s, 1960s era trope image with a universalist perspective, so everybody can put themselves into it, with an African flair as well, acknowledging his own connection with that continent. And you know the 4,000 distinct languages that came from Africa, and the remarkable genetic diversity among the human population. I just think that kind of stuff is absolutely fascinating to me. And he does a lot of this kind of work where he plays with historical expectations. Like here, he's revisiting op art that was very strong in Europe and the US about 60, 70 years ago, and updating it and just doing a lot of really fun things. And Walid Rod, we already talked about the work right there. And stuff like this I just think is exciting to me, because artists are finding ways to get us to think about not just our histories, but our relationship with histories historical momentum, cultural narratives, memories, family legends. How does all that fit together? I don't know if you guys remember, there was a spat of really low budget horror movies that one of them was I Know What You Did last summer, and then the sequel, I Know What You Did Last Summer in June or whatever, and the sequel, I Know What You Did Last Summer, but it wasn't really last summer, it was like a year and a half earlier. You know what I mean? Those kind of things where a bunch of people, the setup for the horror movie is that the history that everybody's denied comes back in it with a vengeance, and just really lots of bad entertainment. But you also get an awful lot of incredibly wonderful art being built as people are not just navigating their own relationship with those relationships, but also inviting us to navigate it with them, or inviting us to think about how we think about history. And these are things that I think could not have existed, could not have been in the artistic lexicon 50, 60 years ago, because people just were not at a point where they could think about art in the kind of way that we think about art today. And it's just fascinating. Can you imagine video art, game design and development, all that kind of stuff that are the realms for these kind of conversations? Can you imagine anybody trying to do that 60, 70 years ago? They probably would have been locked up. They probably were locked up if they did. But I think it's absolutely amazing. So what do you guys think about this stuff that we've talked about this week?
It's pretty different to everything else that we covered because in this in the artwork that we're looking at, it's very historical. It's very heavy on covering historical topics and tackling them in a way that the artists think they should be represented as. And before, it's just been what we've been told and just repeating it over and over again.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful point, because that kind of perception also separates out the Impressionists from everybody that came before. The Impressionists were the first artists that really started thinking about creating art from their own perception as opposed to what was everybody else was expecting. And what you're just talking about is historically artists were producing art the way and talking about art the way that they thought that they were expected to do so. That's what I understand you were saying, right? And the art that we're looking at this week is specifically people kind of challenging those expectations, just like the Impressionists did with visual language. Well, yeah, very, very much so. How about you, Jenny? Any observations about this week?
Well, what I thought was interesting is having this subject as like the last module is like previous ones we've like covered like the Renaissance and the Baroque, like everything like what America was saying, like everything that we've already known and grown up with. So having this like the last module is really interesting because it's like we are as artists we're building upon what was previously done or techniques or ideas and we're just building upon it. And so with this idea of we're looking back into the history and we're learning about it, then we can therefore kind of learn from it as well as changing the narrative from negative in some respects to more of a positive view.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said that, because I wanted to do something that just asks us to or invites us to look at artists that invite us to look at our own perceptions of history, because all we've done is look at the history, the things that come before. And I'm really glad that you pointed out that it's something that is generally more positive. I really do not believe that anger and hatred can be a sustaining fuel for artistic production. And even though artists like Sharon Nishat and Carol Walker talk about things that are really painful, they do it in such a way that when you get done, you feel like a part of you that didn't need to be there got cut off, or something was opened up and you grew a little bit. And sometimes growth can hurt. All of us have had growing pains. But in the end, even the artwork that came from a place of pain, they've delivered it in such a way that it is healing and transformative. And I love that kind of thing. The power that art has, or one of the powers that art can have, is, of course, to completely devastate and destroy. But the best art, the most sustainable art, is something that allows us to have conversations with ourselves and other people that lead to things like growth and healing. And I think that's wonderful. So I'm thank you, Jenny, for saying that. I'm really glad, because I actually just put this in because I thought it was interesting. I didn't realize that it had that kind of relationship with the information. But from now on, I will pretend that that's what I intended all along. So great. Any last questions? Did I talk about the final?
Yes, where it's the 4 questions and we have to answer them.
Okay, great. That was, and then the next couple of weeks, what we're going to be doing is it'll give everybody an opportunity to turn in things that need to be, or return in things, and it will also, every week when we meet, we're going to be talking about and sharing different people's projects, so we can learn what other people have done and see what they've done. Now, next week, we are going to be meeting, but we're going to be meeting on Tuesday. I think I may have said that already. As soon as we get off this meeting, I will make that change. And I do not expect very many people to show up. I hope that you guys do. And anybody who can is more than welcome. But we will be meeting Tuesday at 7:30 and going over the module at the class period at that time. And then the next week we'll go back to Thursday. I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful week. Stay safe and stay well during your Thanksgiving break, and do whatever you can to avoid the topics of politics, religion, and anything that you know is sensitive for your family members. So I would rather you stay in contact with them afterwards. And in the previous class, one person said, okay, so I know exactly what to bring up if I don't want to talk to people. But so please be safe, be well, and I will look forward to visiting with you guys on Tuesday.